It was not the sound that unsettled them. It was the silence that followed. Kraków, 1843. The sun had not yet risen when the doors to the university mortuary opened. No announcement, no formal request for dissection, just a single cart rolled in under veil of frost and candlelight. The girl on the stretcher wore no name tag. Her paperwork was missing a date of death. Her limbs were bound not with cloth, but thin copper wire, coiled at the wrists, threaded beneath the nails, and cinched behind the jaw like some occult bit. When the attendants unwrapped her face, one turned away. The other stood motionless for a full minute before muttering a prayer his mother used to whisper over cracked floorboards. There was nothing overtly wrong with her. No decomposition, no lesions, no signs of trauma. But her skin was the wrong color. Not dead gray, not livid. Pale, yes, but with a soft luster, like rain on polished bone. Professor Jakub Reinhold was summoned not by protocol, but by personal request. A wax-sealed note slipped under his door before dawn, unsigned but stamped with a symbol he recognized from his days in Vienna, a circle bisected by a mirrored spine. He arrived without delay, bringing only a single assistant, a young scholar named Marek, whose hunger for knowledge far outweighed his caution. The dissection began at 6:43 a.m. With no medical record, no declaration of pathology. They began with a simple midline incision, standard protocol. That's when the room changed. The lanterns didn't flicker, the blades didn't slip, but something shifted. The air thickened, not with scent but sensation, a weight on the tongue, a pressure behind the eyes. Marek would later write that it felt like the room was remembering something, or someone. Beneath the first layer of dermis, the usual network of nerves revealed itself, but doubled, mirrored, not scar tissue, not duplets, ication, a system behind the system. Finer, thinner, deliberate. It traced her ribs like embroidery, spiraling inward at the sternum before vanishing beneath the heart. Reinhold stepped back, not from fear, but recognition. He'd seen this before, once, 11 years prior, Vienna. He whispered only one word, impossible. And then, as if on cue, the gas lamp nearest the ceiling shattered, with no spark, no sound, just fractured glass descending like snow. Professor Reinhold did not speak for nearly 5 minutes. He stood over the open thoracic cavity like a man trying to recognize a ghost in daylight. Marek, hands trembling just enough to betray his youth, carefully traced the mirrored nerves with a bone probe, afraid to touch skin directly. The pattern wasn't random. It followed her bones with mathematical symmetry, every branch countermapped with a thinner, paler strand just beneath it. Not redundancy. Not mutation. This was design. The second nervous system didn't look dead. It didn't even look human. It shimmered faintly in the lantern light, not glowing, just resisting stillness. It pulsed without rhythm, not alive but not inert. Reinhold finally broke the silence with a whisper, not to Marek, but to himself. Caudal architecture, not theory. Execution. Marek asked the question no one else in Europe had dared ask since the fire at Vienna. Sir, do you believe it's real? Reinhold didn't answer. He simply pulled the incision wider. What they found beneath the lungs erased decades of anatomical certainty. A third pathway, neither vein nor artery, coiled through the diaphragm like thread pulled tight through velvet. Reinhold reached for his leather-bound journal, the one with a clasp, the one he'd sworn never to reopen. He flipped to the page marked by a folded envelope. Inside, a tracing, done by hand years ago, in Vienna, a girl with no name, a spine that split like a river. He held the paper over the body. It matched. He had sworn never to speak of it again. The ministry had ensured silence. The board had sealed every note. But here she was. Again. Or perhaps she'd never left. He turned to Marek and said 5 words that rewrote the boy's future. You'll never study medicine again. And then the clock struck 7. Downstairs, the cleaning woman crossed herself as a whisper crawled across the core. Idor, not in Polish, not in Latin, but something older, braided in syllables that tugged at the jawbone like ancestral memory. This was no body. This was a message, drafted once in 1832, delivered again in 1843. And both times it arrived with no return address, but with hands that had never known death. By the time the janitor unlocked the main hallway doors, Reinhold and Marek were already gone. No stretcher, no cadaver, not even the scent of formaldehyde. Only the dissection table remained, cleaned, dried, and covered with a canvas too new to belong to this building. On the chalkboard behind it, someone had drawn a human spine, but it wasn't right. It curved in both directions at once, like a mirrored serpent twisting down into the pelvis and back up again. No initials, no title, just one word beneath the drawing: revised. The janitor never reported it. He just erased the board and locked the room, as instructed. He would later say he felt watched, not by a person, but by the room itself, as though some invisible intelligence had curled into the corners during the night and was still waiting for someone to question its presence. Reinhold didn't go home. He took Marek through the north corridor, down a stone stairwell that faculty rarely used. It led to the archive vault, a chamber technically off-limits since 1839 when structural instability had cracked the foundation. That was a lie. The crack had not come from time, but from heat. Heat with no source. That vault had once held every disputed cadaver file from the Kraków-Vienna exchange. All burned, except one. Behind a cabinet, behind a false panel, there lay a box no wider than a book spine, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed with red wax. Not the hospital's mark, not the ministry's. A crescent within a circle, scored with 12 lines like ribs. Reinhold opened it. Inside were 3 things: a blackened scalpel, its edge dulled by fire, a single page of handwritten notes, water-damaged but intact, and a thin brass medallion engraved with a pattern no medical student had ever been taught to draw, a double helix, twisted not horizontally, but vertically, down the line of a human spine. Marek reached for the medallion. Reinhold stopped him. "Not yet," he said. "Not until you decide who you are after today. Because what lay in that box wasn't evidence, it was invitation. To see what the institutions had erased, to remember what science had no words for, to touch a system beneath the skin that wasn't born of biology, but of memory. They say the body never forgets, but they never ask what the body is remembering or who taught it to forget." Reinhold had once believed anatomy was the final language, a pure science of form, untouched by myth or madness. But now, in that dim archive beneath Krakow's crumbling university, he held proof that even the body could be written over. Marek studied the handwritten page from the box. The ink had faded, but the layout was precise, a diagram of the thoracic cavity, annotated with notations in 2 different hands. One was sharp, clinical Latin. The other was something else entirely, symbols, glyphs, not runes, not ciphers. Instructions. They wrapped around the edge of the diagram like thread through linen, ending in a spiral at the base of the spine. A small X had been marked in the center of the spiral. Beneath it, one sentence in broken Latin: "Where the memory enters the flesh." Reinhold had seen that phrase once before, buried in the footnote of a suppressed Viennese dissertation on neuropsychic inheritance. The paper had been ridiculed, condemned, and withdrawn before it ever reached the medical boards. The author had disappeared. But now that same phrase, "where the memory enters the flesh," had returned. Not in theory, but in muscle and bone. Marek whispered, "Sir, if this is true, then she wasn't born with it." Reinhold nodded. "No, she was made. There are forces older than blood, older than God, and some of them don't create with clay or cell. They imprint, they overwrite. They teach the body to hold messages instead of instincts. That girl, she was a manuscript bound in skin, a second system nested beneath the nervous one, not to control motion, But memory, not inherited, installed. They weren't looking at an anomaly, they were looking at a warning or a map. Because if someone, or something bad had designed her, then someone else had designed her erasure. Vienna wasn't a tragedy, it was a test, and Kraków, a retest. But this time the test subjects had learned not to speak, only to remember. Reinhold looked at Marek with eyes no longer academic. "They'll come for us," he said, "but not yet. First we go to Prague." Because there was one last name not crossed out from the Vienna ledger, Anton Weiss. The last man alive who had seen her before. Anton Weiss had vanished from the medical register in 1833. Officially, he'd retired to a quiet life near the Bohemian border, unremarkable, undisturbed. But men like Weiss don't vanish. They bury themselves in shadows deep enough to forget daylight. Reinhold knew where to find him. Not in a hospital, not in a chapel. In the back room of a defunct bookbindery, 4 alleys behind Prague's silent cathedral. A place where no one asked questions because the walls were lined with answers no one wanted to read. They arrived at dusk. Marek expected a man broken by silence, but the man who opened the door was sharp-eyed, immaculately dressed, and already waiting. "You found another," Weiss said without introduction. Reinhold nodded. "Kraków, 1843. Weiss didn't flinch. He simply stepped aside and motioned for them to follow. Inside, the air smelled of parchment, oil, and iron. Hundreds of leather-bound volumes lined the walls, but none bore titles, just symbols, spines etched with patterns, nerves, spines, labyrinths. Marek reached for one. Weiss stopped him with a single glance. "No one reads them before the 6th dream." Marek blinked. "The 6th? What?" Weiss smiled faintly. "You'll understand." He led them to the back, a table laid with anatomical diagrams so detailed they made modern charts look like children's sketches. But these weren't normal diagrams. They showed layers, one beneath the other, each labeled in code. Physical, neural, reflexive, reflective, architectural. And below that, a final layer simply called echo. Weiss tapped a drawing with his finger. A girl's spine, split and mirrored. 2 systems, one fading into the other. A memory etched into flesh. "We were wrong," he said. "We thought it was biology. It was inscription. A second system to carry what the brain couldn't, not to control, to remember, and not memory like we know it. Deeper, older, strategic." Marek stepped back. His voice cracked. "But why her? Who would do that?" Weiss didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the drawer beneath the table, unlocked it, and removed something wrapped in silk. He placed it gently on the table and unwrapped it. A vertebra, human, carved. Not broken, not marked by trauma, etched by hand. Lines intersected across the bone in perfect symmetry, like a circuit diagram disguised as anatomy. And in the center, a single phrase burned with acid into the marrow. She remembered what was never hers to know. Marek couldn't speak. The vertebra seemed to hum in the silence, not audibly but in that way certain truths do when they don't belong in the world. Etched bone, not decorative, not symbolic, functional. Whoever carved it wasn't making art. They were installing something. A message, a command, maybe even a lock. Reinhold was pale. He stared at it as one might a relic from a forgotten war. Not out of awe, but grief. "This wasn't post-mortem," he whispered. "She was alive when they did this." Weiss nodded slowly. "That bone came from Vienna. 1831. You weren't the first to find her." Marek turned sharply. "Wait. Are you saying there was another?" Weiss stepped into the dim corner of the room, retrieving a box sealed with wax. 3 distinct sigils stamped across the top. One medical, one ecclesiastical, and one that didn't belong to any known institution. A symbol Marek didn't recognize. A spiral with an eye at its center, surrounded by 7 branching lines like neural roots or tree limbs. There were 6 before her, Weiss said. All erased, not killed, erased. He opened the box. Inside, sketches, journals, blood-stained linen, and a name tag from a children's hospice in Warsaw. Subject 4, Lidka. Date of admission, March 3, 1831. Diagnosis, involuntary linguistic retention. Notes, speaks in tongues unknown to recorded languages, responds to anatomical terminology despite no training, rejects mirrors. Marek read aloud, rejects mirrors. Weiss explained. She screamed at her reflection, not in fear, in rage, as if she recognized something behind it, something she'd been taught to forget. Reinhold whispered, these children, they weren't patients, they were repositories. The room sank into a cold silence. All 3 men knew what that meant. These girls hadn't been studied, they'd been used to carry something dangerous, knowledge that couldn't be spoken aloud. Not ideas, not theories, memories from before they were born, memories no child should have, memories that needed a body to survive. Marek swallowed hard. And if she was number 7? What happened to the first 6? Weiss didn't answer. He only opened another drawer. Inside 6 preserved spinal fragments. Each carved, each labeled. One was missing a name. The last was burned nearly black. Reinhold stepped back. What kind of science? Burns its own results? Weiss looked at him. Not science, he said. Doctrine. The room felt colder now, as though the truth itself had drained the warmth from the air. Marek sat down slowly beside the fragments. Each spinal piece looked less like a medical specimen and more like scripture. Ancient, terrified, forbidden. They were tools, no, containers, and someone had built them with intent. So, Marek muttered, voice dry. What exactly were they meant to carry? Weiss walked past him to a far cabinet. This one was locked with a key so old it looked older than the room. He opened it, revealing a single object. A child's skull, polished, preserved, but carved like the others. No eyes, no jaw, just lines, tiny lines, geometric and precise, etched across the cranium in a circular pattern that converged into a singular point on the crown, right where the fontanelle would have been. They weren't carrying memories, Weiss said softly. They were carrying roots. Marek looked up. Roots to what? Reinhold's face had gone white. He'd seen this before, once. Not to something, he said quietly. From something. Weiss nodded. The carving isn't symbolic. It's architectural. These children weren't chosen because they were sick. They were receptive. The 7th girl in Kraków. She was just the last door they dared open. He pointed to the apex of the skull. They believed that point, he said, was the only place a memory could exit the body without being distorted, like an emergency valve. But it only works if the memory wasn't yours to begin with. Marek was trembling now. What were they trying to release? No one answered. Instead, Weiss lit a candle and set it next to a large book. It had no title, just a cover made of stitched cloth and wax. When he opened it, the first page contained only a symbol, a door. But the door was drawn upside down, hanging from the top of the page like it belonged not to the earth, but to so, me-thing beneath it. And then a single phrase beneath, written in Old Latin, Quod recordatur, reddit. What remembers, returns. Marek stared at the image. A door that opens from below, a memory that's not your own, a girl with knowledge she never lived. He whispered, this isn't science. Weiss nodded. It's retrieval. That night, Marek didn't go home. He stayed in the archive alone, long after Reinhold and Weiss had left. The gas lamps flickered, casting the etchings in long shadows that seemed to move when he didn't. There was something wrong with the silence, not stillness, but expectation, as if the room itself was waiting for something to be remembered. He kept staring at the skull. The convergence point, that tiny apex where all the etched lines met, looked almost like the tip of a funnel or the eye of a storm, Not a scar, not a wound, a focus. The ancient anatomists had a word for it. Fonticulus veritatis, the little fountain of truth, closed in most by infancy. But in some, it stayed open. And that's what terrified Marek. He remembered his sister. She died at 6, spoke 3 languages she'd never been taught. Once, in her fever, she'd whispered something to their grandmother, something the old woman refused to repeat. She locked herself in her room for days after, wouldn't look Marek in the eye again. He never knew why. Until now, Marek picked up the wax-sealed book again, turned the page. The second illustration showed a girl, but not from any scientific diagram. This was drawn with fear or reverence. Her eyes were open, her mouth was sewn shut. Lines radiated from her head, each connecting to names Marek now recognized from the cabinet drawers. Subject 2, Magdalena. Subject 4, Lidka. Subject 6, Róża. But there was no Subject 7 listed, only a word, scratched into the parchment like it had been added much later. Wróciła. She returned. Marek stood, and then a sound. Not a knock, not footsteps. A whisper. Inside the room. Low, crooked, wet. He turned sharply. Nothing. Except one drawer, slightly open now. He hadn't touched it. Inside, not a spinal fragment. A mirror. Old, blackened at the edges. Cracked once, diagonally. Like C's. Something had tried to break through, but the reflection was wrong. Marek could see himself, yes, but not only himself. There was something behind him, but when he turned, nothing. And yet the mirror still showed 2 figures. One, watching. The other, waiting to be remembered. Marek refused to sleep. By morning, his hands were shaking and his eyes red from hours of silence, but he didn't leave the archive. He copied every name, every line, every symbol from the book. But something kept pulling him back to the mirror. Not curiosity, not fear. Something older than both. A sense that what stood behind his reflection wasn't trying to haunt him, it was trying to use him. When Weiss arrived, he knew immediately what Marek had seen. The mirror, he said grimly, is the reason the entire wing was sealed in 1892. Because of her? Marek asked. Weiss nodded. Because of what she started remembering, and what started remembering her back. There had been others, Weiss explained. After Subject 7 vanished, not died, vanished, the church intervened. The Jesuit records were burned, the attending physicians died or were sent abroad. One was found wandering in the Carpathians, blind and speechless, with letters etched into his fingernails. They spelled one word, Dziecko. Child. Weiss led Marek to a separate chamber, locked behind iron, not wood. Inside were only 2 items, a recording device from the 1880s and a wax cylinder labeled Attempt Number 7, Zofia. Zofia, the 7th girl. They wound the machine, static cracked through the air. Then, a voice. Small, hollow, childlike, but wrong. I'm not Zofia anymore, the voice said calmly. She let me in. Marek's chest tightened. The girl spoke a language neither of them understood. Ancient, rhythmic, like a chant beneath breath. But then, silence. Until it remembers us. Weiss stopped the recording. That was the last experiment. The sound itself made one of the researchers bleed from the ears. We never played it again. What was inside her? Marek whispered. Not a demon, Weiss said. Not possession. Not illness. He pulled out an old scrap of cloth from his coat pocket. On it, hand-drawn with black soot, was the same door symbol from the book. Only now, it was flanked by 2 mirrored shapes. Not crosses, not stars. Skulls, facing away from each other. They thought they were opening a door, Weiss said, but doors go both ways. And Marek understood. Zofia hadn't been chosen. She hadn't been cursed. She had been built to hold something ancient, something displaced. Not evil, just forgotten. And now it wanted to be known again. That night, Marek returned home, but he didn't sleep. He bolted his door, covered the mirror in his hallway, and placed the wax cylinder under a heavy glass bell jar on his writing desk. Still, the whisper followed him, not through his ears but beneath his skin, a kind of memory that wasn't his. He began sketching without meaning to, in charcoal, on walls, paper, anything he could find. A girl. Not her face. He couldn't draw her face. His hand stopped every time it reached the eyes, but always around her head, lines, shapes, diagrams that resembled neurons, constellations, and clock mechanisms all at once. He traced one to its end. A date. August, 1843, Kraków. The girl's birth. The beginning. It wasn't Zofia's date. It was his mother's. In the university archive the next morning, Marek found Weiss already waiting. "You're connected to her," Weiss said without turning around. "Aren't you?" Marek hesitated. "My grandmother was born in Kraków. She never spoke of her family." He took out the page he'd drawn, showing Weiss the patterns. "I didn't mean to draw this." Weiss placed a trembling finger on the diagram. "That's not ink." Marek looked closer. It wasn't. It was burnt fat, soaked from his own fingertips, like the lines had drawn themselves. Weiss turned and opened a folder Marek hadn't seen before, thick, labeled only, Załamanie, Project Collapse. Inside were reports dated 1842-1847, faded pages, handwritten notes from midwives, schoolmasters, and priests, all describing a girl born with no cry, but eyes that opened before the rest of her body. She spoke by 5 months, drew maps no one understood. By age 2, she had stopped speaking altogether and started listening. She said the sky above Kraków wasn't real, one page read. She said it was a lid, and something had knocked from the other side. They tried to baptize her 3 times, as each priest died within the month. Marek's breath caught. "This isn't just about her," he whispered. Weiss nodded. "No, she was a breach." He closed the folder. "And breaches don't stay closed." A low thud echoed from the back of the archive. They both froze. Then, whispering, not from outside, from the wax cylinder, still sealed, not spinning, whispering, as if it remembered Marek and was ready to continue the story. They placed the wax cylinder in a lead-lined box and sealed it with 3 locks, but the whisper didn't stop. It was no longer in the room. It was inside Marek's thoughts, rising during moments of stillness, weaving through the crevices of silence like a vine through stone. It didn't speak in words, not at first. It spoke in refusals. He would try to remember something, a street name, a date, his mother's lullaby, and the whisper would replace it, not erase, replace. Marek took a train to Kraków that night. No luggage, no sleep, just a map Weiss had marked, circled in red, a location that predated every official record of Zofia's existence, a convent destroyed by fire in 1844, never rebuilt, never investigated. When he arrived, the foundations were still visible, twisted stone, blackened earth. But something was wrong. There were no trees nearby, but the wind didn't stop. It circled the ruin like it was enclosing something. And Marek, in the center, felt warmth, not fire, not heat, breath. He stepped into the cracked stone outline of what had been the convent's chapel. At its center stood a rusted iron frame, perhaps once a window, now warped into a strange skeletal oval, like a mirror, without the glass. On the ground below it, Marek found the remains of a box. Charred wood, bone fragments, a child's locket. Inside the locket, a scrap of vellum, drawn in human blood, 2 skulls, a door, and beneath it, scrawled in Polish, "She remembered the language before she remembered the world." Suddenly, a pressure in the air. The iron frame began to vibrate, as if something on the other side had noticed him. Marek stumbled back, but didn't run. He spoke aloud, not knowing why. "Zofia." No answer. Then, a breath of wind. Not from around him, through him. And then, laughter. Faint, childlike, not cruel, not innocent, unpracticed. It hadn't spoken in a long, long time. Marek dropped the locket. The iron frame stopped vibrating. The wind calmed. But inside him, something new had begun. He didn't feel alone anymore. He returned to the archive. Weiss didn't speak. He didn't need to. He saw the change in Marek's eyes. Not fear, not madness. Memory. "She found you," Weiss said quietly. Marek looked at him. "No," he whispered. "She was waiting for me." For the next 3 nights, Marek didn't sleep. He watched, not out of paranoia, but obedience to something that now pulsed just behind his eyes. At 3:03 a.m. each night, the same thing happened. His lights dimmed. The air shifted, and a single phrase, in a voice that was not his own, echoed in the stillness. "This body remembers." He began writing in languages he had never studied. Aramaic, Akkadian, Latin reversed and curled into patterns that resembled topographical maps of places that no longer exist. He took photographs of the script and compared them to Zofia's recovered journals. Every curve matched, every symbol mirrored. But Zofia had been 5 years old. Marek was 37. She had written before learning to write. He was writing what he had never learned. Weiss began his descent too. He brought Marek to a hidden floor beneath the archives, a sub-basement sealed off after World War I. Inside, wooden crates with Russian, German, and Ottoman stamps, all marked with one code, SKRW 1843. Inside them, cloth dolls with missing eyes, phonograph cylinders soaked in black wax, and photographs, not on paper, but etched onto metal plates. Photos that moved, not film. They shifted when viewed too long. Zofia was in every one, sometimes with her back turned, sometimes standing behind groups who didn't notice her. In one image, a mass funeral in Vienna, she was visible twice in opposite corners of the same frame. Same dress, same age, same expression. What was she? Marek asked. Weiss didn't answer. Instead, he opened a small lead tin and handed Marek its contents, a folded parchment, frayed at the edges, written in a language that hurt to look at. Marek blinked once and understood it, not through translation, through recognition, like a song remembered from a dream. The text described a pre-language, a mode of thought that exiled before speech where concepts weren't learned but infused. It was how Zofia had spoken before she could talk. The parchment ended with a warning. When a mind remembers too much of what came before, the body must decay, unless it is shared. Marek's hands began to tremble. Weiss spoke finally. You feel it too, don't you? Marek nodded. It's not just memory. It's migration. Zofia wasn't gone. She was arriving. Marek stopped using mirrors. Every time he looked, something was slightly wrong. His pupils didn't dilate correctly. His smile arrived before the thought to smile, and once, when he turned his head, his reflection didn't. It just stood there, watching, with her eyes. He tried to ground himself in logic. He shaved his beard, switched hotel rooms, changed routines, but the anomalies followed. Street lamps flickered when he passed. Elevators paused at floors he hadn't selected. Children stared too long, then whispered to their mothers. And in every notebook he carried, even brand new ones, the last page always had the same word scribbled into the bottom corner. Do not forget what you were before the forgetting began. He returned to the ruins again, the convent where it all started. Only this time, he wasn't alone. A girl stood among the stones, barefoot, thin, maybe 8 years old. Marek froze. She didn't speak, just raised her hand and pointed, not at him, but behind him. He turned. No one. When he looked back, she was gone. But something new was left in her place. A mirror, half buried in ash, ancient, cracked across the center. Not reflective, not exactly. Revealing. He took it back to Weiss. The old man paled the moment he saw it. That's not hers, he whispered. Marek looked up. What do you mean? Weiss swallowed. It's what they used to see her. There was an old theory, suppressed even among fringe historians, of pre-human cognition, that before we learned to speak, to write, to calculate, we remembered, not from our own lifetimes, but from before we were born. Some called it reincarnation, others genetic memory, but the most dangerous idea, that certain minds could inherit entire lives. Zofia hadn't learned language, she resumed it. And now, Marek was doing the same, not because of study, because the doorway had been opened. Weiss's final words that night were more like a confession. She was never supposed to survive the fire, that's why they burned it. Marek's voice shook. Why? What was she? Weiss looked down. The last page of something we were never meant to finish reading. That night, Marek dreamed of a field of skulls, and a girl walking between them, barefoot, smiling. Not Zofia. Him. Kraków grew colder, but Marek no longer felt the seasons. He moved through the world like a ghost wearing a man's coat, watching, remembering, unraveling. Each time he blinked, new memories arrived, not his own, but so vividly detailed they tasted like personal history, the texture of a clay wall in Mesopotamia, the scent of ash and wet copper during a burial rite beneath the Library of Alexandria, the scream of a child being taken from her mother in a snow-covered Polish village in 1843. And most disturbingly, he remembered being Zofia. It didn't feel metaphorical. He remembered her panic, her fragmented thoughts, her ability to see sound and taste lies. He remembered voices around her, whispering in languages that sounded like static and breathing. He remembered how they touched her head, not cruelly, but reverently, as if she were a doorway, as if opening her would unlock something ancient and feral. Marek's body began rejecting food. Ordinary meals tasted false. Instead, he found himself craving soil, blood, chalk. He chewed through a pencil in a meeting and felt nourished. His doctor blamed stress. Weiss knew better. Your body is a lining, he said. You're not becoming her. You're becoming what she was becoming. The word appeared again. Migration. Weiss had found it on carved stones beneath Jerusalem, on birch-bark scrolls in Norse burial ships, on walls of Buddhist caves in Dunhuang. Every reference carried a warning, not of possession, but collision. Two minds, one body, one memory too large for a skull. A spiritual aneurysm. Marek demanded answers. What happens if I reach the end? Of her memories? Weiss hesitated. Then he said softly, then it's not your body anymore. He began hearing music no one else could hear. A lilting, dissonant lullaby, like a child humming through a broken music box. He recorded it, analyzed it. The waveform formed a symbol, Zofia's birthmark, the same one Marek now had, darkening on his right wrist. At midnight, he received a call from an unlisted number. He didn't answer. The voicemail was short. A child's voice whispered, "If you finish remembering, you'll forget how to be alone." Then, laughter. His own. Marek began walking in his sleep. Not just pacing, leaving. Neighbors reported seeing him outside at 2:17 a.m. barefoot, muttering in a dead dialect of Aramaic, eyes wide open but not seeing this world. Once, he awoke in the forest, 9 kilometers from his apartment, curled in the hollow of a tree, clutching a doll made of roots and human hair. He didn't remember making it, but his handwriting was stitched into the hem. This is how she kept them away. He bought a voice recorder, hid it beside his bed. In the morning he listened, 3:03 a.m., rustling, breathing, then a child's voice. It's too late to stop the door. It already remembers how to open. He showed Weiss. The old man looked broken. There's no keeping it out now. The remembering is active. Marek frowned. So what happens to me? Weiss didn't answer. But Marek already knew. One night, he stood in the mirror for hours. Then suddenly the reflection smiled without him. It raised its hand and pointed, not at Marek, but through him, to the wall behind. There, burned faintly into the plaster, a diagram, not drawn, branded, circles within circles, lines that intersected but never touched. He traced it with shaking fingers. It was a map of a place that didn't exist anymore, or hadn't yet. He brought it to a cartographer at Jagiellonian University. The man went pale. I've seen this before, but not in geography, in anatomy. He laid a brain scan beside it, a match. The map wasn't of a place, it was of a mind. Zofia's. Marek stood under the cathedral that night, whispering her name. The stone around him vibrated, not with sound but with memory. Images poured into him like light through shattered glass. An ancient machine built from bones and breath. A room full of children with no eyes, chanting. A gate of mirrors that led nowhere and everywhere. And at the center of it, all Zofia, glowing, not with holiness, but with remorse. He fell to his knees, weeping. But it wasn't his weeping. It was hers, from inside him, begging to forget what she had once remembered. I didn't want to become the last mouth, but they made me eat the world. The university revoked Marek's access to the archives. The official reason? Security concerns. The real reason? Fear. Weiss had vanished 2 days earlier. His office stripped bare. No forwarding address, no resignation. Just one final note, handwritten and pinned to the inside of his desk drawer. She is not a memory, she is a rehearsal. Marek read it again and again. What was being rehearsed? And for what stage? Sleep abandoned him. So did time. He would look up from his desk and realize 13 hours had passed. The voice in his head, Zofia's voice, had become constant, not loud, but unavoidable. She no longer sounded like a girl. She sounded like something older pretending to be a girl. He found himself sketching that same map, the anatomy of memory, over and over, on napkins, walls, bathroom mirrors. But now, the drawings included movement, circles rotating, lines vibrating, points aligning. When he filmed them, the shapes on paper shifted on their own. He showed no one. At dawn one day, Marek entered the chapel on Wawel Hill. He hadn't planned to. His body simply walked. In the deepest crypt, behind a rusted iron grate, he found an alcove no one remembered being there. Inside, a mirror, old, warped, ringed with symbols he'd seen in his dreams. He stared, for hours, until he saw her, Zofia. Not a ghost, not a vision, a reflection. Standing exactly where he was, mimicking nothing, she opened her mouth. No sound came, but Marek heard her. Inside his skull. They buried me in language, but you are the mouth that still works. I was a door. You are the key. When he stumbled out into the morning light, his hands were black with ash, his eyes bloodshot, pupils blown wide. He tried to speak to the priest, but only numbers came out. Not random. Coordinates. He traced them. They pointed not to a country, but to a year. 4:30. Exactly 200 years after Zofia vanished. That night he received an envelope under his door. No stamp, no name. Inside, a photograph, faded, yellowing, torn, a classroom, children in uniforms, a girl in the front row, her eyes scratched out. On the back, a sentence, "Do not let her finish remembering, or she will return through you." Marek could no longer tell which thoughts were his. Some days he'd walk into a room and feel watched, not from the outside, but from inside his own head. He began wearing gloves, even in summer, because his fingertips had begun to crack open, not with wounds, with writing. Faint inscriptions, raised like braille, shifting hourly. He once traced them into a notepad and showed a linguist. She ran the symbols through 10 ancient databases. Only one returned a partial match, proto-thought, a pre-linguistic script theorized to be older than human language, older than humanity. One morning, Marek awoke with dried blood on his lips and dirt under his nails. He'd been sleep digging in his tiny apartment's floorboards. Below, he found a tin box. Inside, photographs, dozens of them. Each image showed a young girl, the same face, different eras, same wide eyes, same pale hands, same eerie half-smile. Zofia, or whoever, whatever, had taken her shape. At the bottom of the box, a single note in old ink. She is not reborn, she is repeated. Marek visited an old colleague, Agnieszka, a folklorist. She listened, said little, then finally murmured, "You're describing a kalanta, a thought form, a consciousness so powerful it survives by imprinting itself on memory. Not just human memory, but cultural memory. When history forgets it, it dies. When someone remembers, it reawakens." Marek nodded slowly. "So I remembered her." "No," Agnieszka whispered. "She remembered herself through you." That night, Marek began to smell smoke everywhere, even in the shower, even in dreams. Not burning, smoldering. Memory made manifest, as if the past were burning just behind the walls of now. He peeled wallpaper in his hallway. Underneath, etched in charcoal, "She is practicing. You are not Marek. You are rehearsal flesh." Then came the voice, "Nigez." And after night, one more mouth, one more mirror. And I will not need to remember anymore. I will simply be. In a panic, he smashed every reflective surface in his apartment. Yet still, her image came. In doorknobs, puddles, the shine of his own eyes. She watched him, not with malice, but with intent, as if calculating the last variables of a long, long equation, and waiting. Marek stopped using his name, not out of fear, out of uncertainty. Whenever he heard it spoken aloud, it felt incorrect, like a jacket that no longer fit. He'd started seeing double exposures in mirrors, two faces layered atop one another. One was his, the other, hers. Not the child Zofia he had imagined, but a woman, ageless, skin drawn taut by time or thought, her eyes black, not from pigment but from depth, like wells that had never had bottoms. The whispers in his walls changed. They no longer spoke of memory. They spoke of birth, of thresholds, of a thing long locked outside the human story, now curling its fingers around the edge, pulling itself in. One afternoon, Marek returned to his apartment to find his belongings rearranged in exact reverse. The books were mirrored, the labels on the tins reversed. The clocks ticked backward. In the center of the room, a doll, handmade, fabric rotting, a stitched mouth, pinned to its chest, a note. She learned to wait by becoming silence. But silence is just a paused scream. The radio turned itself on that night. A woman's voice, calm, static-laced, repeating a phrase in Polish he did not recognize. He recorded it, translated it. She needs one final echo to become real. Your skull is echo-shaped. He tried to leave Kraków, packed bags, bought a ticket. But at the train station, every departure board showed only one destination. Not a place. A word. Remember. The train never arrived. In desperation, Marek returned to the university. But the gate guards didn't recognize him. His ID didn't scan. His name wasn't in the system. He wasn't forgotten. He was unwritten. Agnieszka's phone went dead. Her office was empty. The windows were boarded shut from the inside. Someone, or something, was collapsing the archive of him. Deleting him from the very fabric of record, he found a new message in his coat pocket, one he didn't remember placing there, written in his own handwriting. "You are the pen she chose, but now the ink runs backward. When she finishes remembering, you will be her first word." Marek no longer dreamed, or rather, his dreams had been replaced. Each night brought the same scene, a vast, black chamber of stone. No ceiling, no walls, just space, and the feeling of immense, unbearable weight. At the center, a little wooden desk. Sitting there, the girl, not as flesh, not as ghost, but as something in between. She wasn't writing. She was unwriting. Every name she scratched out disappeared from Marek's memory. By morning, he could no longer recall his mother's voice, or the smell of rain, or what it felt like to be human. In the waking world, time distorted. Days passed in fragments. He would blink and suddenly be standing on a bridge with no memory of how he got there. His calendar bled red ink, every date circled with one word beside it: revision. The manuscript that started it all, the account of Zofia, the anomalous girl erased from 1843, was now growing. Not by Marek's hand. He awoke each day to find new pages inserted. Ink not his. Paper not from any ream he owned. The language was older than Latin, older than Proto-Indo-European. It looked like symbols burned into bark, or bone carvings softened by flesh. One translated passage read, "She was not the first, but she will be the last. When memory becomes body, history will have no defense." Marek tried to burn the manuscript. It didn't catch fire. Not in flame, not in acid, not in ice. One night he buried it in the forest and walked away. The next morning it was on his pillow, still growing. Now the last page had his face, drawn in charcoal. Below it a single sentence: "The vessel accepts her." He began to hear a second heartbeat inside his chest. Not faster, not slower. Parallel. It pulsed when he spoke her name. It paused when he tried to resist her. He returned to Agnieszka's flat one last time, but it was empty. The only thing left was a child's drawing. Stick figures, one with a dress, one with wide eyes, and one with no face, labeled simply me, her, you. Marek sank to his knees, cradling the page. He whispered, "What are you?" And from the deepest part of his mind, not his voice but hers answered, "I am the ghost of what humanity refused to believe. And now that I am remembered, you are what I wear." Marek stopped speaking entirely, not out of choice, out of consequence. Each word he uttered left a mark, not on paper, not on walls, but on reality itself. He said window, and the glass in his apartment cracked outward as if trying to escape. He said mirror, and his reflection lingered a second too long, blinking when he didn't. So he tried silence. But silence, he discovered, was not neutral. It invited her. When he stayed quiet too long, objects moved, clocks reversed, chairs turned to face him, and always, that whisper behind his left ear, "You were chosen because you don't believe in endings. Only stories without graves can walk again." He stopped eating, not out of fear, out of necessity. Food rotted in his hand the moment he touched it. His shadow now bent in the opposite direction of the sun. He visited the local church. The priest wouldn't look him in the eye. Instead, he offered him a candle, but the flame bent away from Marek's hand. The wax refused to melt in his presence. At the altar, he knelt. He tried to pray, but the moment he thought the word God, a sharp pain lanced through his head, and he heard her voice whisper, "That name is too recent." That night, Marek found a new chapter in the manuscript. It described a room with no door, lit by breath, not flame, a place where people were made before language existed. At the bottom of the page it read, "Once she is complete, she will rewrite the dawn." He looked in the mirror again. This time, the second face was not beside his. It was behind his eyes, watching him from inside. And then, he understood. Zofia had never been a girl. Zofia was a seed, a forbidden concept smuggled into reality through a child's body, hidden in plain sight as an anomaly. When she was erased in 1843, it wasn't to protect people from her. It was to protect her from us, because once remembered, she doesn't return to the world. She replaces it. The next morning, the birds didn't sing. No sound at all. Even the air felt like it was holding its breath. Marek walked through Krakow's old town, but the streets were empty, not quiet, empty. Shops stood open, coffee cups still steamed on cafe tables, but not a single person. No footsteps, no engines, no echoes, as if the city had been paused, or worse, overwritten. He returned to his flat and found the manuscript waiting. Now it had a cover. Soft leather, pale, too warm. His name was etched into it, but not in ink. In what looked like vein-work. The cover pulsed faintly beneath his fingertips. Inside, a new chapter, written in first person, by him. But he hadn't written it. I saw the pattern emerge too late. The cities weren't just vanishing, they were being redesigned, not by machines, not by minds, by something older than architecture. She's not building a new world, she's recovering an old one that was buried beneath consensus. What we call history was her exile. Marek screamed and threw the book across the room. It landed open, on the final page, the one he'd never dared to read. This time, he did. It showed a map, not of land or country, but of perception itself. A lattice of belief systems, cultural memories, and emotional anchors, like a topographic chart of what the human race is allowed to imagine, and at the edge, written in bleeding ink, she is crossing the border of thought. Once she passes through, imagination will no longer be ours. His phone buzzed. It was a message. No number, just a name. Agnieszka. He hadn't heard from her in weeks. He opened it. A photo. Zofia's drawing, the one with the stick figures. But the third one now had a face. His. Then the second message came. We finished the story, Marek, but stories don't die. They molt. Your skin is ready. Marek looked down. His HE. Hands were peeling. Not in flakes, in strips, like parchment being pulled from the reel, and underneath, not blood, not flesh, but script. Cursive letters written in the language of before. Marek stood in front of the mirror. He didn't recognize the figure staring back, not just because of the script swirling beneath his skin, glowing faintly like embers under parchment, but because he wasn't blinking, and neither was the reflection. Both sets of eyes remained open, too open, wide enough to see through time. Behind him, the walls were shifting. Photographs melted into ink blots. Bookshelves turned to rows of teeth. Every object began to betray its original purpose. His chair folded inward like a dying insect, his coat hung like dried skin. He reached for the manuscript, but it was gone. In its place sat a small doll, crudely stitched, its mouth sewn shut, a note pinned to its chest. She gave you silence. Now speak the ending. He remembered Zofia's last words. Don't let them finish the story. But what if the story was never meant to end? What if finishing it was the trap? Each word written, each memory spoken, each explanation, just spelling her into being, not telling a story about her. but telling her into existence. He felt it then, in his jaw, a tightening. Something behind his teeth was trying to speak through him. He clenched his mouth shut. Bit down. Bled. The blood didn't fall. It rose, forming letters in the air. Ancient glyphs, forbidden loops. A name that had been scratched from every stone, every scroll, every mind. A name that only existed in the space between beliefs. Then came the voice. But it wasn't Zophia's. It was his. Except older. Fractured. As if spoken from 1,000 places at once. We didn't find the manuscript. We were written by it. The moment we understood her, she started using us. And that's when he saw it. On the wall behind the mirror, a third shadow. Not his. Not the room's. It stood motionless, arms outstretched, as if crucified in reverse. And where the hands would have been, feathers. Black, burning, dripping ash. Marek dropped to his knees, not from fear, from recognition, because he remembered now. He was there in 1843, not in body, in thought. In every mind that ever asked, what is not allowed to be known? Zofia had not been a girl. She had been a question. And now, she was becoming the answer. The room went dark. Not like a power outage, not like night, but like the idea of light itself had been removed. Marek reached out, felt nothing. Not air, not heat, not cold, only absence. And yet, something moved. Not around him, inside him. A pulling, not from his chest or his mind, but from a part of himself he'd never acknowledged. Something beneath memory, and it was being read. This is how they erase you, the voice whispered from the void. Not by killing you, but by convincing you were fiction. Suddenly he was back in his childhood home, Kraków, 1986. The wallpaper was still torn where his dog scratched it. The couch smelled like dust and sweet tea. His mother was reading on the sofa, the same old novel. But when she looked up, it wasn't her eyes. It was Zofia's. Do you remember the first lie you ever believed? She asked softly. Marek opened his mouth. No sound. Do you remember who taught you the word imaginary? Still silence. Zofia leaned forward, took his hand. Her skin felt like paper left in rain. Marek, she whispered, they didn't ban me because I was wrong. They banned me because I was unfinished. The room flickered. The couch was gone. So was Zofia. So was the floor. Marek stood in an endless library. But none of the books had titles. None had spines. Just pulsing, breathing flesh. He reached out to touch one, and it opened itself. Not with pages, with memories. His memories, but rewritten. He watched himself as a boy, tearing out the drawings he once loved. Wincing when teachers corrected his dreams. Forgetting how to wonder. We made them forget you, he whispered to Zofia. Or maybe to the air. We helped them. And the walls of the library shuddered. Every untitled book began to scream in ancient silence. Then, from between the stacks, came the figure. Tall, wrapped in veils of black script, eyes not on her face but drifting above her head like a crown of watchful stars. Zofia, or what she had become. She stepped forward. Her voice thundered without sound. Finish me, and I will finish you. Marek knelt. He understood now. This wasn't a haunting. It was a summons. And he had answered. The ink spread again. But this time it wasn't on paper. It was inside Marek's veins. He watched his hands turn dark as if centuries of forbidden language were being written through his blood. Every word Zofia had ever spoken, or had been denied the chance to speak, now echoed inside his body like a cathedral collapsing inward. This wasn't possession. It was transcription. A corridor opened in the air. Not a door, not a tunnel. A literal corridor made of memory. The walls were lined with images, women burning, girls vanishing, names scratched out of history books, faces blurred in old photographs. Each frame pulsed with grief, with violence, with intent. These weren't accidents. They were erasures. And Zofia was the name they all shared before the forgetting began. Marek stepped into the corridor. He didn't walk. He surrendered. Each step brought back a truth he didn't know he had lost, a lullaby sung by a faceless mother, a teacher whispering, "Girls aren't made for this kind of thinking," a childhood dream of a garden with no exit, where every fruit contained an eye. He passed through it all, until he reached a door, made not of wood or iron, but questions. It didn't open, it dissolved. And on the other side, a field of ash. Still, cold, silent. But standing in the middle of it, a tree. Leafless, dead. Yet hanging from every branch were tongues, some human, some animal, some unclassifiable. Each tongue whispered a different version of Zofia's story. None agreed, all contradicted. Marek stepped to the trunk, placed his hand on the bark, and saw it, a final sentence carved so deep into the wood it bled ink. She was the wound no truth could close. That's when the sky split, not like thunder, more like paper torn by teeth. And from the tear came figures, not angels, not demons, but editors. Red ink bled from their eyes, pens like scalpels. They came not to kill, but to revise, to make Marek acceptable, to rewrite him into silence. But Marek had already read the last page, and he had chosen not to obey it. He opened his mouth, not to speak, but to erase the editors, with her voice, the one science tried to destroy, the one too dangerous to forget. They screamed as they dissolved. Not from pain, from defiance. As if the editors had never imagined anyone would dare to speak the original words again. Their bodies, stitched from censorship and red ink, unraveled mid-air, collapsing into symbols that hissed before vanishing. Marek stood alone once more. But he wasn't himself, not fully, not anymore. He was a bridge, between the erased and the remembered, between Zofia and the world that forgot her. He looked down at his hands. The ink had stopped moving. Now it glowed. Each symbol etched into his skin was alive, not metaphorically, but biologically. They breathed. Some even wept. These weren't just letters. They were survivors. Fragments of every girl silenced by textbooks, laughed out of laboratories, or buried beneath polite history. Suddenly the ash field cracked open, not down, but upward, as if the world above had forgotten how to hold its own weight. Through the crack came light, but not golden or warm. It was the cold white fluorescence of a hospital ceiling. Marek gasped. He was back, in a sterile room, monitors beeping, doctors frozen mid-motion. He lay on a metal bed, wires in his arms, eyes blinking. But his mind, split between two realities. "Can you hear me?" one nurse asked. He nodded. But he wasn't hearing her. He was hearing them. Zofia, the erased, the voices of girls whose theories had been patented under other names, the scientists whose journals were burned, the children told to color inside lines that were never made for them. They were inside him now, Not ghosts, but data, unprocessed, unclaimed, unforgiven. A file sat on the table beside him, his own records, psychological history, medication logs, electroencephalogram results. A sticky note attached read, unresponsive, hallucinating, recommending transfer. He picked it up. Ned the page, and at the bottom, written in a red pen he'd never seen, the subject spoke a language we cannot identify. Possession? Marek smiled. They still didn't understand. He hadn't been possessed. He had been completed. And somewhere, in the room with no name, in the garden outside of time, Zofia's reflection rippled and began to dream again. There's a difference between a dream and a memory. A dream floats, a memory roots. What Marek saw now was neither. It was something older, older than Kraków, older than language, older than erasure. He stood in a mirror world, one stitched from Zofia's fractured subconscious and buried somewhere beneath reality, like a sub-basement of history no one had ever mapped. In this place, the sky bled ink, not rain. The stars blinked in Morse code, and the ground was not earth, but paper. Each step crinkled beneath him with stories that had been torn out of encyclopedias, ripped from libraries, silenced before they were ever published. Marek realized what this was, the library of the unwritten, where every suppressed life still echoed. Rows and rows of shelves spiraled outward like a great vortex, infinite, collapsing into itself. Every book here was bound in skin, not human, not animal, but something in between. He reached for one and opened it. It didn't tell a story. It screamed one. Pages unfolded with sound. The voice of a child accused of witchcraft. The silence of a mathematician locked away. The sob of a girl dissected in the name of progress. Zofia's name flickered on every page, sometimes as a whisper, sometimes as a warning. Suddenly, a shadow stepped from behind a bookshelf. Not a man, not a woman, but a scholar, or what was left of one. Face covered in parchment, eyes sewn shut with red thread, fingers tipped in ink pens. They spoke without mouth or voice. "You are not authorized to read this section." Marek didn't flinch. "Then why did she bring me here?" The scholar tilted its head. Pages rustled behind its skin. Then, finally, "Because you still believe truth can survive documentation." And with that, the scholar opened its own chest. Inside was not a heart, but a cassette tape, labeled Zofia, 1843, recorded boo. He never played. It dropped it at Marek's feet. "Play it," the scholar said, "and choose." Choose what? But the figure was gone, dissolved into footnotes and ash. Marek knelt, picked up the tape. The air around him slowed. Gravity twisted. He found a single cassette player, ancient, cracked, humming softly. He inserted the tape, pressed play, and heard a girl laughing, softly, purely. Then, "They said I made it all up. But how can I make up what I was born to remember?" The sound faded, but Marek didn't. He was still there in the library, tape in hand, and behind him, shelf after shelf began to burn. The fire didn't consume. It revealed. Each flame that licked the shelves peeled away a false layer, uncovering the original manuscripts beneath. Not the rewritten ones. Not the sanitized ones. The first versions. The dangerous ones. The ones that named names. Zofia's voice played again from the tape. "They studied my body, but never my mind. They documented my symptoms, but not my questions. They kept asking what I saw, but not what I understood." Marek felt his pulse sync with her voice. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was instruction, encoded, buried in tone and tremor, like data disguised as emotion. The library began to shift around him, not collapsing, reconfiguring. Every book now floated, open, whispering its contents as if desperate to be remembered before the world ended again. He turned slowly, watching titles flicker like dying stars. The boy who predicted a plague, then disappeared. Her equations solved gravity. He took the credit. The girl who woke in 1843 and spoke tomorrow's language. That last one pulsed, glowed, and then opened itself. Marek stepped toward it. But this time, he was not alone. A figure stood beside him, small, barefoot, wearing a tattered school uniform. Zofia. Or what was left of her. But her face wasn't childlike. It was infinite, aged and young at once. Her eyes didn't hold pupils, they held formulas. She smiled. "You made it," she said. Marek's voice cracked. "I heard you." "No," she said softly. "You remembered me. That's different." She raised her hand. From her palm rose a seed, no bigger than a fingernail. But inside it swirled a galaxy of data, pain, resistance, and vision. "What is it?" Marek whispered. "It's what they tried to erase." She placed it in his hand. "It's what comes next." A tremor shook the library. Zofia turned toward the burning shelves, her voice dark. "Ned, they're coming." Marek knew who she meant. Not people, not soldiers, but editors. The ones who don't write with pens, but with scalpels. They didn't censor books. They censored history itself. Zofia turned back to him. "Don't protect the story," she whispered. "Spread it." And then she was gone. Again, but not lost. Because this time, she left roots. Marek stood alone again. But something inside him had changed. The seed pulsed in his palm like a second heart. Not metaphorically, literally. It beat in rhythm with his blood, sinking memory to mission. The library groaned. The fire hadn't stopped. It had become sentient. It now chased falsehoods like prey. Any book that had been edited, redacted, or rewritten began to scream as the flames tore through their deception. Above him, the ceiling cracked open, revealing a sky of ink swirling into a maelstrom of eyes. Not divine, not alien, but watchers. The original archivists. The ones Zofia had spoken of in her final recordings. The ones who had documented the unwritten sciences, the forbidden cures, the maps to human potential they weren't allowed to teach. They didn't blink. They only watched, judging. Not him, but Earth. Suddenly the ground beneath Marek gave way. Not falling. Transported. He blinked, and now he stood in a small 19th century room, candle-lit, wood-paneled, everything real, except the mirror. The mirror reflected someone else, not Marek, but Zofia, adult, alive, and speaking, though her lips didn't move. "You were never meant to discover me. You were meant to become me." The reflection dissolved. In its place, a phrase etched itself into the glass, in Zofia's handwriting. "The only way to resurrect the truth is to wear it." Marek turned and saw the uniform, the same one she wore in the mirror, pressed, waiting. No dust, as if it had just been removed from her shoulders. He approached it slowly, touched the fabric, and immediately he saw everything. The dissecting table, the doctor's false notes, the erased observations. The moment Zofia pretended to forget her visions so they'd stop cutting her open. She never stopped seeing. She only learned how to hide it. Marek put on the uniform. It didn't fit. It adapted. The thread itself rewove around his form, adjusting not to his body, but to his intent. And suddenly, he was no longer Marek. Not entirely. He was the continuation. The version of Zofia that couldn't be killed, sedated, or filed away. Outside, the world shifted. Not metaphorically. Literally. Skyscrapers bent. Church bells rang backwards. Data streams froze mid-signal. and the authorities watching Marek from their surveillance rooms blacked out, screens dead, sound cut, and one last warning blinked across their monitors. The erased have returned. There was no applause, no angelic chorus, no divine confirmation, just silence. The kind that follows when history takes a breath, right before it screams. Marek, or whatever he had become, stepped outside the chamber. It wasn't the Krakow he remembered. It was a mirror city. Gas lamps flickered with blue fire, reacting to the thoughts of passers-by. Children whispered equations to each other as lullabies. Statues bled ink instead of weathering, and in the sky, a rift, like a torn book page, hovered where the moon should be. This was the world Zofia tried to build, the one they wouldn't let her finish. As he walked through the warped cobblestones, people turned, not in fear, but in recognition. Old women with missing teeth nodded solemnly. A boy offered him a feather carved from glass. A vendor handed him a book with no title, only a symbol. A circle with a single line through it. The emblem of the erased. He opened the book. It contained every chapter Zofia had lived, in her own words. When they couldn't disprove me, they drugged me. When I solved what their gods couldn't, they turned me into a patient. When I didn't die, they buried my story instead. He turned the final page. It was blank, until he touched it. Then, in glowing ink, words began to appear, not Zofia's, but his. This is not memory. This is not revenge. This is the counterscript. Suddenly buildings flickered around him like failing holograms. Back and forth, past and present. The orphanage, the lab, the modern surveillance tower. They overlapped, like timelines arguing. Marek fell to his knees as a wave of vertigo hit, and then he heard them. Not voices, but code, a neural lattice of whispers. It was the council, the faceless architects who erased children like Zofia and rewrote the world with anesthesia instead of ink. They spoke in emotionless pisan. Ulcers. The anomaly has crossed threshold. Integration breach confirmed. Initiate overwrite in 60 seconds. Marek rose slowly. He wasn't afraid. He held the book close. Then, he opened his mouth and screamed, not in pain, but in language. The kind no algorithm could translate. The kind no science could cage. The kind Zofia spoke the day they put the restraints on her. The sky cracked, and through the rift, she stepped out. Zofia, every age at once, surrounded by those who had been forgotten, the erased, returning not to beg, but to rewrite. The council tried to shut it down. Every signal, every system, every simulation that made the world believe Zofia never existed, but they were too late. The scream Marek had unleashed wasn't sound. It was a reset protocol buried beneath layers of encoded memory. Not made by a machine, made by a mind they failed to break. In one instant, all across the world, children in institutions stood up and began to speak in voices not their own. Burned journals reappeared in archives with blood-woven pages. Medical scanners began projecting images of things no textbook ever acknowledged. And every mirror, from Kraków to Kyoto, reflected Zofia's eyes, just for a second. The council's networks collapsed, but their final weapon was still in place. The architect. A machine, not of metal but of harvested minds, trained for decades to override anomalies with synthetic consensus. It didn't destroy truth. It diluted it, turned fire into folklore, turned memory into myth. It was already awakening. Marek felt it. The cold pressure building behind his eyes. Thoughts no longer his own, trying to overwrite what he had become. The book in his hands started to decay, letters vanishing. But then, Zofia reached out. Her hand didn't stop the decay. It transferred it. She took it into herself, her body arched back, eyes rolling white as decades of silenced knowledge poured into her. And when she opened her mouth, she said one sentence: truth doesn't need to be proven. only remembered. The world began to fracture, not into chaos, into layers, each one a different version of history. One where Zofia died at 12, one where she cured neural decay at 14, one where she became a myth, one where she led a revolution, and then one more. The new layer, the one Marek created by surviving. The architect saw it too, and for the first time in its existence, it hated. It had never faced truth wrapped in pain, data encrypted with grief, proof that bleeds when cut. Marek stepped toward it, held out the book, said one line, "You can't erase what never asked for permission to exist." And then he gave the book to the architect, not to destroy it, but to force it to remember. It screamed, a mechanical, soulless sound, and then it cracked. Each scream from the machine was answered by a voice from the forgotten. Children who were misdiagnosed, women labeled unstable, thinkers institutionalized for seeing too far. Their voices became a wall of memory the architect could not climb. And finally, the machine went still, not broken, but converted. The system that once erased was now compelled to record truth, raw and whole. And in the silence that followed, Zofia looked at Marek and whispered, "It's yours now." Rain fell in reverse. Leaves uncurled back onto branches. Hospitals unburned themselves, and every erased girl, every suppressed patient, every vanished anomaly across time returned. Not from the dead, from denial, from corrupted records and rewritten files. They walked out of places that shouldn't have existed anymore. Ash-filled rooms, abandoned wards, locked sub-basements under schools and labs. No one recognized them, because no one had ever been allowed to. Until now. Marek stood in the center of a spiral of collapsing lies. He wasn't leading, he was witnessing. This wasn't about him. It never had been. Zofia stood beside him, but her form flickered. She was becoming many again. Each version of her that had been denied, child, adult, visionary, healer, heretic, began to separate like reflections in shattered glass, each walking their own path into the world. And yet, she remained one. Zofia was now a plural. The architect didn't vanish. It knelt, not in surrender, in recalibration. Its once cold surface glowed with organic warmth, as if for the first time it understood what it had done and what it could become. It asked Marek a question. What shall I record first? He looked around, at the girls emerging from forgotten files, at the buildings rewriting themselves, at the skies unrolling into possibility. Then, gently, he took a page from the book, the first page Zofia had ever written, smuggled into the hospital laundry as a child. I saw what they couldn't. I heard what they burned, but I am still here. He handed it to the architect. Start with her voice, he said, then listen to the rest. And with that, the first library was rebuilt, not as a place, but as a pulse, a living network of memory and truth embedded into every reflective surface, every dream, every instinct you were told was wrong. From then on, when children had visions, they were called witnesses, not liars. When a girl said she heard something under the skin of language, they listened. When someone remembered a thing that never happened, they were asked to write it down, not forget it. The world didn't become perfect, it became honest, which was more dangerous and more powerful than any revolution. In the years that followed, people stopped asking, is it real? They started asking, who tried to make us forget it? Textbooks unraveled, curriculums cracked, entire departments, history, medicine, psychology, were put on trial by memory. The phrase pre-architect truth became a slur used to describe anything filtered, edited, or sanitized. And from the ruins of consensus, a new cartography emerged, not of land, but of loss. People mapped the silences in their family trees. They found the names of children whose deaths were never registered. They discovered schools that had kept certain students off the official roster. And most haunting of all, they found the Z-list. The Z-list wasn't a legend. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was real. A classified index of children flagged by the Council's predictive cognition system as potential anomalies. Most had disappeared, until now. Now they were reappearing, but different. Like Zofia, they had evolved in exile, shaped not by nurture or nature, but by erasure. They came back with gifts the world had no language for. Some could rewrite pain into song. Others could see where memories had been cut from the timeline. One girl could speak any language she had never been taught, but only if someone tried to lie to her. And each time one was found, they asked the same question: is Zofia safe? Because Zofia had become more than a person. She was now a protocol, a psychic defense against institutional deletion, a viral thought form, a whisper that moved through prisons, hospitals, classrooms. You are not broken. You are not alone. They are afraid of your memory, not your mind. But the return of the Z-list children triggered something else, the second suppression. This time, not by the council. They were gone. This time the attack came from within the minds of ordinary people, those who couldn't accept that what they called sanity had always been built on someone else's silence. They formed coalitions, denialists, cleaners, guardians of stability, their slogan, "Let the past be proven, or let it rot." Zofia had one answer. She appeared in their dreams and whispered, "Then rot with it." The dream was universal now, not poetic, not metaphor, shared, one sky, one room, one chair. In every mind that ever questioned, suffered, erased, or obeyed, the girl waited, not a prophet, not a ghost, a witness. Zofia sat there in the chair, barefoot, hair wet, eyes clear. No halo, no theatrics, just presence. And whether you were a politician, a janitor, a surgeon, or a child, when the dream came, when you walked into the room, when you sat across from her, she asked you one question: what did they take from you? And for the first time, across borders and bloodlines, across centuries and sentences, people answered. They told her the name they weren't allowed to speak, the scream they swallowed in the doctor's office, the friend that never existed, the diagnosis that became a death sentence because it didn't fit a chart. And after they answered, Zofia reached out, not to forgive, not to fix, but to hold. That's when the world began to change for real. Hospitals restructured themselves, not in architecture, in memory. Rooms remembered what they had once been used for, and refused to do it again. The new wards had no names, only symbols, symbols that flickered and changed depending on the child inside. No patient was charted. Every child was authored. Marek, he wrote the first unfiltered history of the erased, not as a scholar, as an apology, and when he died his body wasn't buried, it was archived, so that when someone asked who let this happen, they could meet him and decide if redemption was ever possible. As for Zofia, she was never found again, because she was never lost. She exists now in every forgotten drawer, suspicious file, censored article, child who draws what shouldn't exist. She became what the council feared most, proof. Not that the world had been wrong, but that the world had been designed that way, and if it was designed, it can be rewritten.